These days, nearly every company is a technology company, or they better become one soon, even yours. And businesses that embrace this kind of thinking will stand apart, but like everything make or break, a change like this brings new complications, new obstacles, like finding the right talent, and just keeping up with the pace of innovation and customer expectations of quality and speed that are, let's just say, challenging. Build as a Service helps organizations clear the hurdles, providing the ability to not only compete, but lead. Built on the as-a-service model, BaaS is your seamless access to the right expertise, working in teams to rapidly create and deliver. Totally flexible, totally scalable, and absolutely predictable. Build as a Service is that always ready, instantly available engine that helps you craft custom-built modern software, the software your business runs on, and the products and experiences your customers love, all while harnessing the data that helps you see around corners, so you always know what's coming. You could say that Build as a Service is all about closing the distance between concept and creation, ideation and revolution, now and next. And it'll help you build your future today.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of DevOps Digest, where we invite experienced builders to come to the show and we ask them to break down important and fundamental DevOps concepts so that you can easily understand these concepts. In this first episode, we're going to talk about private cloud with Mustafa El-Hilo. Mustafa has many years of experience with private cloud, and he's going to help us understand what private cloud really is. And because everyone is talking about public cloud these days, Mustafa is going to tell us whether private cloud is dead or not. So let's welcome Mustafa now. Mustafa, welcome to the show.
Hey.
How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing well. How about you?
Yeah, I'm very good as well. So before we get into today's topic, I just wanted to do a little introduction. So why don't you tell us a little about yourself, and also, if you don't mind, a fun fact about yourself as well.
Okay, yeah. I'm Mustafa El-Hilo. I'm an architect at Slalom Build. I'm part of the Cloud DevOps and Security team, and I've been at Slalom for around 2 years now. And a fun fact about me is before Slalom, my entire career was mostly on-prem, and I've touched very little professionally public cloud, other than like a few labs for myself on AWS or GCP just to play with it. But that was it.
That's interesting, because we're here to talk about private cloud, so I think we have the right person, right?
I hope so.
Yeah. So just to kick things off, I just wanted to go over a few definitions, because when usually we hear that companies they're moving to the cloud, we usually think about AWS, GCP, Azure, etc. So these are the public cloud provider, but people don't realize that there's also the private cloud, which is also the on-prem. And so maybe let's make this distinction. So tell us a little bit about what is private cloud and how does that compare to public cloud?
Okay. Yeah. So when we talk about private cloud today, I think we're going to be focusing primarily on-prem, because there's a distinct flavor where like AWS can give you a private cloud, but we're going to put that off to the side and we're just going to ignore that. So when we talk about on-prem, it kind of comes into two main flavors. The main flavor being you own the data center. It's a managed space by your own enterprise, your own company. And you're doing your own cooling, electricity, networking, storage, servers, racking, unracking, decommissioning. Everything is under your control. Everything is under kind of the guidelines that you want to implement. And that kind of ranges from how much lack of security you want to how much extreme security you want, right? So that's kind of with that one flavor. And then the second flavor that it comes in is where you rent space. Equinox is a big example of that, which they provide power, cooling, and racks. And essentially, you just bring your own hardware, rack it, connect it to the internet, and kind of get going from there. And those are kind of like the two big flavors. They mainly compare to public cloud in the sense of I'd say the big distinction is investment. When you're doing your own thing, you're putting upfront money to pay for capacity. You're putting upfront money to purchase servers, networking, storage. You're kind of making the assessments yourself. How much growth, how much new servers do you need? So you're dealing with things with a long outlook. Generally speaking, like a life cycle is either between 3 or 5 years. I've seen companies run them past 5 years, but kind of your operational costs will shoot up after that. But I don't want to go into that. But that's kind of like with public cloud, you're starting small, and then incrementally you're growing. With private, you're more starting really big, and then adding more and more workload until you hit your scale, and then you expand, right?
Yeah, and I think that brings a good topic. So in terms of scalability, so in public cloud, it's very easy for you to just, spin up a server, or even if you're using technologies like Lambda, that is very scalable as well. When it comes to the private cloud, which is still on-prem, you're probably going to have to, plan ahead of time, right, in terms of capacity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's exactly it, right? Because with the scalability part is very important now for businesses, right? Because if I'm running let's say a web app, right? And today I know that I'm only going to have 100 users, and I will only have 100 users. That kind of planning is fairly straightforward. You know what your usage is, you know what your peak usage. But other applications, it's not really that straightforward. You want to go up, you want to go down. It's really easy to do that with public cloud. When you're managing your own data center, you're kind of more or less planning for the peak of everything, just to be safe. That's really expensive, right? That's a lot of upfront costs, a lot of investments upfront to kind of meet that peak usage. And sometimes if it surpasses that peak usage, and this is where we'll talk about being hybrid, we see that some companies, what they choose is on-prem up to a certain limit. And then after that, they'll expand into the public cloud or scale up to help them with that little buffer space. And that kind of, in terms of planning, capacity planning for on-prem, some companies do it project by project basis. Other companies kind of upfront build, and then developers will kind of use that as they progress through the year. Capacity planning is a magic of an art. It's really hard to do when you're having to deal with like millions of dollars upfront, and you're kind of like you have to use it, right? You can't like purchase it and then it's just sitting idle because it's really expensive to run. And that's kind of like where the big difference between public and private kind of plays in, is because with public, you go up, you can go down, you can kill your contract after a month. You can't really walk away from a data center if you've built it under like in your basement. Like that's, the investments have been made, and you're stuck with them. And I'll just touch a little bit about as well, like another key difference is we think of public cloud, they provide services, API endpoints, console. Those are ways that the users interact with public cloud to create resources, right? So if you're running that in-house, you more or less have to provide equivalent service, right? So if a developer wants five servers on a whim, because they need running a POC, or they're going to production, or like whatever the use case is, now, like the best way I can describe it as, your local IT team is competing with AWS, GCP, and Azure, because they have to provide that kind of same flexibility, so that the developer has a good experience. They can maintain their velocity. They can. So that's, I find that like those two things always come head to head. Where like you bring in a developer into your new company, your company now is running on-prem, and the expectation right now in today, in like 2021, is I want a server, I will get a server, right? I want a database, I want a database endpoint. Like that's where the bar is. It's not that I want a database, okay, wait 4 weeks because we need to buy a server. Like you can't, what kind of velocity is that, right? That's
exactly. It's a different mindset, right?
it's a very different mindset. Like, I want a database, I want it now, and you're gonna get it now. And that's something like Kubernetes, for example. It's a really good example of a tool. If you're on-prem or in the cloud, the interface is the same for the end.
Right.
Hypervisors do that to a certain extent, but you'll need to orchestrate quite a lot around it. You still need the layer that like Kubernetes provides, right? So even if you're running VMware and you want to provide developers with the ability to create databases on a whim, you have to wrap it around with either Ansible or Terraform, or there's just many different ways you can do it. But that's it's another kind of like when you're hiring people on and you're running an on-prem, it's a little bit of a different skill set as well. Because again, AWS is providing a service, and that service has a lot of different things, a lot of different features. So when you ask for a database, for example, it comes with backups by default. It comes encrypted by default, right? Those things. But if you're running things on-prem, you have control over everything, which is great, but also means you can really screw things up in many different ways.
That's
right.
True.
Right. So that's kind of like, that's how I see it. Like I've come from a very long on-prem experience. And running things by default on-prem doesn't always work. But in public cloud, more or less it will.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit.
A little bit. No, that's interesting. And you talked about running both public and private clouds at the same time. So this is the hybrid approach, right? That some companies choose to go with. But what kind of challenges do you usually see when companies choose to go with hybrid?
The first one is networking. Usually, how to route your traffic from depends. Like, where is the when a user is hitting your website, for example, is that going to AWS, then to on-prem? And there's usually like a latency, some latency issues that you kind of have to be smart about. The hybrid model is, I would say, it's in terms of complexity, it's way more complex and harder to operate a hybrid model versus two distinct models that are separated, right? Just because you're always stuck between where's the traffic going? Are you scaling in the cloud correctly? And kind of like I touched on this a little bit, but the skill set is slightly different by running on-prem versus running in the cloud. There's different best practices to each. You kind of have to change the way you're thinking about each. So to kind of, when you merge them together, in a lot of cases, it does turn into a bit of a zoo. But again, like if you're smart about how you're doing and what you're specific about what you want to use in the public cloud and how you route that traffic back to on-prem, you can always be successful to do that, right?
Yeah, another challenge sometimes I see as well, especially for those companies that they use the public cloud as a disaster recovery site, let's say, is to have to like replicate all of the data from on-prem, right? So you need to replicate all the data, make sure that all of the backups are available in the public cloud, because then whenever a disaster occurs, then you need to quickly switch. And how are you going to spin up everything that fast, right? Yeah,
and that's why we always say, good disaster recovery is as good as the time you've trained to turn it on. A recovery plan that you have in a document that has never been executed is useless. So if you are doing, and the challenge as well, like, okay, now your disaster recovery is in public cloud, you've successfully turned it all back on. What's your plan to undo that and go back on-prem?
That's true.
That's where the challenge as well lies, because sometimes, like, just think of them as two different API endpoints, right? Public cloud is different; it operates differently. So when you move workloads, there will be slightly different behaviors between the two. That's kind of what I mean, right? Like we migrated applications from private into public, and more or less it's usually fine. But the networking itself in private is different. It traverses different layers, right? It goes from your EC2 to it's just a completely different stack than what you have on-prem. So there will be different behaviors.
Yeah, that's true. And how about if you want to have, so you talked about just different behaviors. So what if you want to have the same behavior that you have on AWS on-prem? Are there options, or even other cloud providers? So are there options that you can bring their services to your own data center?
Yeah, so AWS, I think Outpost is an example of that, where AWS will ship you a rack. This is a bit new to me. I've worked before where you purchase a full rack and it's just a storage appliance, and the whole thing comes in and you roll into your data center, you plug the power in, and now you have storage, right? So that's kind of like the old model. So AWS is kind of taking that same model, but applying it to storage and compute. So you'll just buy a full rack, and it comes in with like everything you kind of need. I think there's a few services that are only provided that way. I think S3, EC2 come to mind. And that's I believe that's AWS's way to kind of help customers bridge that gap. Customers that feel the gap between on-prem and going to public is so big, and they can't really, they need an introduction to the service, but they want done on their own terms. And I think AWS Outposts kind of do that, right? You'll bring AWS into your data center under your network. The big difference though is this isn't like you buying 6 servers and a storage array, and you, like, if one of the drives fail, you yourself are going to replace it. I think with AWS Outposts, you pretty much can't even open the cage. If something happens, AWS will come in and fix it. So again, it's what we're talking about is like levels of service, right? How managed is the service? So when you're doing things in-house, your operational cost is going to be higher, right? It goes up. So you can either pay someone to do it, which in that case would be public cloud, and you're shifting your main focus now isn't worrying about how much power you need to have in your data center, how much air conditioning you need to have. Are my servers in an ideal state to operate for the next 5 years? Which is why, like, when I talk about kind of that spectrum, how much do you want to do in-house versus pay somebody else to do it? And at every layer, until you get to like Lambda, where you're just writing code, everything else is being paid for. So that's kind of right. That's what Lambda is to me. You want this function to run, and everything under it is being operated and managed by somebody else. Other people want to run Lambda in your own data center, but manage everything underneath. And that control piece is very. A lot of companies kind of feel they want to control every single layer. They believe they can do more with more bang for their buck if they have things on-prem. But yeah, like an example that comes to mind is Dropbox. Dropbox was a small company, and it started out in AWS at that time. They were a small company, now they're not small. And then did a reverse migration and built their own data centers, mainly because they wanted control over the stack. They believed they could build a stack to deliver their product at the same resiliency, the same reliability, but do it in-house by controlling the whole stack.
Right. That's interesting, because we hear about a lot of companies that they cannot keep up with the scalability of providers like AWS, so that's why they make this move. But I guess that Dropbox they took the other way around, right? So they thought that they can actually having their own data center and so on, and so that they did like a reverse migration. Do you see that happening often? Or is there rare cases?
No, that's the example that comes to mind. Like, I don't see Netflix doing that, right?
Right.
Netflix started in AWS, remains in AWS, and I don't think they have any plans to kind of move out of AWS. And they are a huge amount of content, huge amount of compute, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
But no, I like Dropbox is the only is the big example
one.
I keep going back to. Yeah.
Right. And so you're talking about the AWS Outpost, right? That you can get a rack shipped from AWS, and that if you want to do something, you can really. So only AWS has access to it. So when you start thinking about, you're talking about on-prem, private cloud, but then you start mixing, getting the services from the public cloud providers into your own data center. Do you think you kind of like lose control over your things in terms of like security and so on?
Personally, yes, I think so. If you're used to buying servers, buying the storage that you want, having things on a flat network, for example, um, the AWS Outpost at the end of the day is an appliance, right? So you don't know what's in there. So you do lose a level of control, but that level of control that you're losing, you're gaining by having like AWS's API to spin up an EC2 instance, right? So it's things like that. So when you lose control over a specific portion, you're delegating that to a different company to take care of it. And in this case, it's AWS, right? But if you're a company with a really good set of engineers, and you can provide that kind of same functionality using your own servers, so that your developers are delivering products quickly and you're managing the scale, who's to say one approach is wrong, right? If you're able to do it, and that's fine. I don't think that there's one way or the other, but you will always be behind, I feel, right now, just because the big players in the public cloud, they're always coming up with new features, they're always coming up with new products, new managed services. And like with every new managed service, that's one less thing you have to build in-house. So if you want to provide an elastic endpoint for a database inside you have to build an entire framework about how to build it, how to spin it up, how to scale it down, right? So like every single product you want to add into your stack, yes, you have control over it, but because you have control over it, that's a lot of overhead versus one line of code to spin up any database flavor your product needs.
And also, like your team, you're probably not going to have the same size as team as AWS, right? So AWS comes up with all of these managed services, with all of these other services, because they have the team to work on that. But a lot of organizations, they can't really spare a lot of time on creating these different services.
Which is, so that my experience a lot of discussions become about, like if you want to add a new like if you want to add MongoDB in-house and now you want to add Redis, the discussion, if you're running on-prem, the discussion always becomes like, this is an additional tool, additional framework around it, additional best practices around it, right? Its own data recovery, its own data disaster recovery kind of process around it. So what I found is kind of pivoting to different technologies is way slower on-prem. You will kind of pick something and stick to it for a long time, just because pivoting to something else there's a lot of overhead. But if you do that in public cloud, it's just a different API call, and you have the servers to try it out. And maybe that's kind of like one of the benefits. Maybe if you do want to run hybrid, is you use AWS as your playground. You test out ideas, and then kind of when you've confirmed your architecture, you can move it back in-house. There's many different ways to kind of do it. And I think that the thing that's definitely prevalent from what we see is we haven't interacted with a company that doesn't have any footprint in the public cloud currently. Right? So like even if companies are running on-prem, they still have presence in public cloud. Because it gives you that velocity right away, right? Until you confirm what you want to do.
Exactly. Yeah. So I heard a lot about all of the advantages of public cloud, and even gave the example of Dropbox, but you said that you don't actually hear a lot of companies going back on-prem, right? So would you say that private cloud is dead nowadays or in the future?
I don't think so. I think there's still quite a number of use cases where staying private kind of makes sense.
Mhm.
It's just looking at some numbers. I know you're going to ask me that question. I looked at some numbers, and the sales for actual servers has gone up over the last few years that are servers for on-prem, which kind of tells me like on-prem isn't really dead. And I don't think it is. It's just way easier to work with a public cloud than to build your own thing, especially if you're a new company. So if you're like, if it's a big company that has already existed, they've already have on-prem, they've already made the investments over the last 30 years. So those companies would have less appetite to move to public cloud. But if you're a new company and now you're a big company and you've always been in public cloud, shifting back on-prem is very hard because you're so used to that velocity that like, I want a server and I want it now and I'm going to get it now. But if you're used to kind of working kind of that different way where you have to plan things a month in advance if you want a server, I don't suspect that maybe those companies over time will migrate into public. And we do see that, right? That comes up quite often in our work. But that's kind of, right now the numbers say private cloud is growing, specifically in the flavor where you're renting space. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's dead. It's still out there quite prevalently.
Oh, that's great. Well, I really enjoyed this chat. Thank you so much, Mustafa, for joining us today. Is there anything you'd like to add now to the end? Maybe how can people contact you and maybe what have you been up to?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, so if anybody has questions, you can always reach me there. But yeah, no, I personally, from my experience, prefer working on-prem. That control piece, I'm a control freak. I kind of like my whole stack controlled. I kind of like knowing where my packets go. But I think that's biased just because that's what my experience is. Working on-prem gives you like a very unique way of like knowing every single part of your stack, knowing how it works. You have to configure DNS. You have to configure DHCP. Those aren't services that just come when you buy a server. So like it gives you like really a good way to kind of build these tool sets and know how they work. And then things that you take for granted when you work in a public cloud and you've always worked in a public cloud. But I guess those things should just work.
Yeah. Wish it was that easy, right?
But yeah, that's everything.
Oh, that's great. All right. So once again, thank you so much, Mustafa, for joining.
Thanks for having me.